Good morning. This is Claudia Filos with the Center for Hellenic Studies, and we're so delighted to be joined here today by Professor Leonard Muellner. Hi, Lenny.
Hi, everybody.
And by some very near and dear members of our community. Hi, everyone. I hope you will introduce yourselves when you have a chance to ask a question or a comment, but right now I'd just like to introduce you, Lenny, to our community. I know you've joined us many times, but just so briefly, I'll just say that you are Professor Emeritus of Classics at Brandeis University, where you taught for many, many years. You were such a beloved member of that faculty, and I had the great pleasure of studying with you there. And you were also the Director of IT and Publications at the Center for Hellenic Studies. But today you're here to talk to us about Ovid. And in particular, we're thinking about the Metamorphoses. And I'm hoping that you can help us as a community sort of make a bit of a transition today, a little bit of a transformation, because we as a community have really started thinking more and more about Latin literature over the last few weeks. And we're going to be thinking more and more about it and reading more about it in the months and weeks to come. So can you help us start thinking about what it means to read a poem or a work in Latin literature by this author, how that differs from the work that we've been doing and the reading we've been doing around, let's say, Homeric epic? How is this epic different?
Okay, that's a beautiful question and a nice way to look at it. I've always taught Ovid in the context of looking at myths in Greek and Latin literature, and it's a wonderful perspective to have. And that's the one that you have, I think, coming from studying Homer and the tragedians and so forth. When you come to Latin literature, I think one of the most important things is that Latin literature, it sort of looks as though, okay, these things are similar to what I've been reading in Greek poetry, but they're different. It looks like a second take, so to speak, on Greek ways of storytelling and the stories themselves and so forth. That's definitely true, okay? But the key piece is that it's actually sort of the third way, okay? Because in between the older levels of Greek literature, let's say going up to the 5th century BCE to the tragedians, is the Hellenistic era, and that was the immediate model for people like Ovid and also Virgil. Okay, they were already experiencing the classics in the hands of people who were experiencing them for the second time, Greeks who were experiencing them for the second time. So the great Hellenistic poets are people who are not normally part of the canon of classics that most people get to read. There's one that's attested in its entirety. That's the Argonautica of Apollonius of Rhodes. I think some of you may have looked at that. But a lot of the major authors for Latin literature, people like Callimachus, who was a Hellenistic poet, of a very refined type, and who wrote short epics and all kinds of poems that reflected upon the Greek tradition before him. These were the models for the Roman poets, and so when Virgil was a young man, he imitated them and not people. And not the major authors, but the Hellenistic poets who were already responding to the authors that came before them.
Lenny, can I ask a quick question?
Yep.
Because already,
sure.
And you might want to adjust your camera just slightly.
Yep.
So that
okay. All right.
Yeah.
Which way?
As we're doing
like
this.
That?
Yeah, that's
okay.
it. Yep. So your chin doesn't get cut off, because when we get excited, we lean in. I do that too. So listen, so I'm thinking about something. You're saying certain things right now that I think are so different from what we think about when our community talks about a work like the Homeric epic. I mean, we're talking about individual authors here, right?
Right, exactly. That's a huge change, right? That when we're thinking about Homeric epic, we're thinking about a tradition, that's been handed down for generations from over a very long period of time. And here we're talking about individual authors of the kind that we're used to thinking in some way or other, okay? They're much more individualized, and their responses are individualized, and they have a personae, okay? I think we shouldn't go too far with this, okay? For example, when people study Ovid in school, they learn a whole bunch of stories about him and how he was a poet under the regime of Augustus, and he got into trouble, and we don't know exactly what the trouble was. The texts say Carmen et error, a poem and a mistake, and we don't.
Oh no, we've lost contact with Lenny. Okay, so I bet that there is some difficulty with the Wi-Fi in DC. I bet there's a lot of traffic going through those channels in DC today, which is where Lenny's located. I'm sure he's going to join us in just a second. So I just want to orient our community. So just to let everyone know again that we are joining you. I'm joining you from outside of Boston. We're speaking today with Leonard Muellner, who's joining us today to talk about Ovid. And what he's helping us think about today is really some of the distinctions between the Homeric tradition, where we are dealing with oral traditions that have been refined over thousands of years, now to individual authors who are responding to traditions. But I think it's going to help us think about and realize the fact that tradition is still a very important part of what's happening in these poems. We don't want to think about there's just an individual, right? Lenny, can you help us think about that?
Yeah, I dropped out there for a moment,
Yeah.
so I missed the beginning of what you said.
No, I just rehashing. Okay. I think, yeah, please go on.
No, so I think these are the poetic tradition is still an important thing, okay, for these people, and they're more and more learned about poetry, okay. So there's a whereas when you look at, say, the epic tradition in Greek, in ancient Greek, like Homer, and also the body of poetry we call Hesiotic poetry, it looks like there are relationships between things, and there are passages that get repeated, for example, and the older scholarship used to think that they were borrowing from each other and referring to each other when we're talking about Greek epic traditions, where there are parallel passages. But now we tend to think of that as there's a tradition, and different people can draw on the tradition in parallel ways. You don't necessarily have to be referring to texts when you don't necessarily have texts in the sense that we have them. But when it comes to people like Ovid and Virgil and Horace and the imperial poets of the Roman tradition, they know these poems as texts, and they think of them as authored like their own. They look back on them as in that way. But they have these poems as things to read. The reading tradition is still something that I think it's good to think of, for example, the reading tradition as something performed, because rotten poetry is meant to be spoken out loud, okay? It's a different kind of performance tradition, but there's still that component to it. But right. These people are the ideal in Latin is the doctus poeta. Doctus means learned, right? Poet who knows all the texts, okay? And for example, Metamorphoses, this is a title of Ovid's work. It's a kind of typical Hellenistic product. We even have titles of other Metamorphoses, but we have one of them in Greek before Ovid, and it's very similar, stories about human beings being transformed into birds and stones and all sorts of things like that. And these were meant to be, in a sense, collections of stories for poets to use, and so they would learn the stories and then create poems on the basis of them. Okay, we have several of these that survived in antiquity. There's another one called in Greek erotica pathemata, which means the sorrows of love. Okay, which is a lot of very sad stories about lovers and what happened to them, but they're mythological stories about characters who you never heard of, but are part of a lot of local traditions and stuff like that. So these people, in effect, are doing research, if you want, to find traditions that are out of the way and off the mainstream. And when they do deal with the mainstream, they're tweaking it. They're doing things that make it their own. Okay, so in a certain sense, it looks more individualized, but you're still dealing with traditions of stories, right? Mm-hmm. It's important to keep that in mind.
So, sorry, please.
Go ahead.
Well, I know that Maria might have a follow-up because I think she's sort of interested in these topics, and I just wanted to invite her to maybe to comment.
Please, Maria, we'd love to have your perspective.
Well, thank you very much. You've just partially anticipated my question by referring to Poeta Doctus. Because this term keeps coming whenever we read about Latin poetry. Mm-hmm. So as Claudia wonderfully mentioned, this is a side question, and I would like to ask to what extent the research and Homeric scholarship, which actually was established in Alexandria, really in a way helped these poets become or acquire this capacity of Poeta Doctus.
Right. No, I think it's a crucial item, right? It's Alexandria is the chief library that's responsible for this stuff, but also it's important to remember Pergamum as well, which is there were learned poets who were also librarians, okay, even if you want to think of it in these terms. And there were these collections of manuscripts, okay, scrolls of manuscripts that were cataloged and available for people to come and read. So when you don't have publication, when you don't have books that you can buy for $20 online or however you buy books these days, downloading them, okay, then you need to have repositories of scrolls, okay, and it's not within the economic reach of everyone. I think later on in Roman times that becomes, you get a lot of copying of texts, and even, for example, Galen, who's a second in the Roman Empire, complains about people who are copying his texts and messing them up, okay? But they became cheaper, okay? But you have a much more cumbersome process for the reproduction of texts, and so it's not something that we're used to thinking of. But I think libraries like the museum in Alexandria were very important in making available large bodies of text and literature. And the Romans, had access to texts like this, made their own collections of scrolls. As we know this from archaeology in places like Herculaneum, which was one of the sites that was buried by the eruption of Vesuvius. They found houses with villas with large collections of charred papyri. People had their own collections of scrolls, okay, and stuff like that in their homes. So wealthy people did, okay. I think that's an important aspect of Roman poetry too. People like Ovid and Virgil and Horace had patrons, and they were part of the imperial court, okay, and that's how they survived. And that means that they're tied into the imperial ideology. Maybe you noticed at the end of the story of Apollo and Daphne, there's a reference to Augustus, okay, which is a very important theme in the Metamorphoses. It ends, so to speak, with the triumph of Augustus, okay? The big, that's like the ultimate goal is to get there. Right. Great.
Maybe this is the perfect time. Can we switch to thinking about some of the passages right now?
Sure.
Is Apollo and Daphne something you'd like to start with?
Sure, whatever.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh no, the connection in Washington, D.C. is just so difficult today. So I think what would be good is, Sarah, can you share that passage for us? And what we'll do is we can start reading it as Lenny reconnects. Would someone like to read for us?
Okay, I can read.
Great, thank you, Sarah.
And this is from the Dryden and Garth translation. Stay, nymph, he cried. I follow, not a foe.
Okay.
Thus from the lion trips the trembling doe. Thus from the wolf the frightened lamb removes, and from pursuing falcons, fearful doves. Thou shun'st a god, and shun'st a god that loves. Ah, lest some thorn should pierce thy tender foot, or thou shouldst fall in flying my pursuit. To sharp, uneven ways thy steps decline. Abate thy speed, and I will bate of mine. Yet think from whom thou dost so rashly fly. Nor basely born, nor shepherd's swain am I.
Thanks, Sarah, for sharing that.
Beautiful.
So Lenny, right now we're reading from this passage, and this is a Dryden translation, right? This is open. This is something that's in the open and can be shared widely. So that's one of the reasons we're looking at this translation. So why was this a passage that you were asking us to think about as we begin to think about Ovid?
Well, okay. I mean, can I just say a word about the Dryden translation and,
Please,
and
yes.
about Ovid? Because in a way, it's a very it's beautifully done, but it's also very cleverly put together. The rhymes are very effective, and it's amazingly faithful to the Latin. So it's not as though the authors of it really had to twist the text. They were very good poets, and John Dryden especially is famous for that. But the notion of rhymed couplets like that, and sometimes there are longer sequences of rhymes, is in Latin poetry, the structure of the dactylic hexameter, which is the rhythm of this text is the same as the rhythm of Homeric epic. You should all know, but it's a Latin version of it. Okay, and it's been filtered through an aesthetic from Hellenistic times, which stylizes its structure in very beautiful ways. So the lines are very carefully sculpted. It takes, I think the best way of thinking of it is it takes things that are aspects of the structure of the poetic lines that are tendencies in Homeric poetry and makes them into constants, okay, in a certain sense. And so you have rules about the way the words are balanced at the beginning and the end of the line, and around there's a compulsory break in the third foot of every hexameter line. A word ends and another word begins within that foot. And there are rules or a real effort to have balancing words, sometimes even rhyming words, before that word break and at the end of the line. But also there's an ideal sort of line in which you have two nouns, two verbs, and a verb in the middle to keep the peace, is the expression. So these very symmetrical structures. So it's highly beautifully crafted poetry, and Ovid was a master of this, and it seems to be so fluid in his poetry, and seems to be so comfortable in generating poetic lines. And I think you get a sort of sense of that in reading Dryden. At least it does to my ear. Okay. It just seems to flow in a very simple way, even though the language is a little bit archaic. You're dealing with 18th and late 17th century people, after all. It's still very, very liquid and cleverly put together. Anyway, so the question was, why did I pick these passages? Well, I picked the first one, I think, for obvious reasons. Maybe that the ages, the story of the ages, but I wondered if this passage or another passage later on in the story reminded you of something that you all read and maybe remember well in the Homeric epic, in the Iliad, in particular. Do you know what I'm talking about? I don't want to ask stupid questions, but what I'm thinking of is the battle between Achilles and Hector, where you have this famous scene of Hector being chased by Achilles, right? And he can't catch up with him, right? And you have these just in the same way as you have here. It's a little bit later on, it's elaborated. you have this these similes, extended similes in Ovid that are variations on the similes that you have in the Homeric epic. In the Homeric epic, you remember, it's like there's a wonderful simile comparing it to what happens in a dream when you're trying to chase someone and you can never reach them. Okay, it's a fantastic moment in the story. But here you have Apollo's asking Daphne to slow. He says he'll slow down or she'll slow down. Right? It's just a rather it's humorous. Okay, and I think that's an important part of the aesthetic here too. There's a lightheartedness to the whole scene. Okay, that's certainly not part of the epic tradition that we know, right? There's something beguiling and cute about what's going on, right?
Even though it can at the same time be troubling, right? Very troubling.
Exactly.
And that's not being, I don't think that's being discounted. Yeah.
No, and I don't mean to say that you should think of this as poetry as trivialized, okay? But there's a kind of very refined, sophisticated sort of humor that's an important part of Ovid's aesthetic, okay? Right. About how these things work.
Fascinating. Yeah. I think we may have a question about this.
Sure.
One of our community members who is not in this hangout, she couldn't come today, has shared a question. I think, Sarah, can you share that with us?
Yep. This is a question from Georgia, and it is about this passage, and I'll read it out. I'll also paste it in for you. So she says, one of the striking similes, which is, as you've just mentioned, presents Apollo being the greyhound running after Daphne.
Right.
And she's also picked up on that Achilles after Hector, and also in Aeneid running after Turnus. So she's asking her here, Daphne, the frightened hare in the simile, accepts gracefully after her metamorphosis her role of faithfully guarding Augustus' residence. That's referring to Augustus, becoming, as we experience historically, a key symbol of Roman triumph. Daphne is not actually subdued by Apollo, who himself is overwhelmed by Cupid. How are these awkward sort of constellations to be understood in Ovid's Augustan age?
That's a beautiful question. I'm not sure. I think it's a wonderful observation that there's this tension, so to speak, that then in a certain sense gets resolved in a way that happens often enough in ritual terms too, okay? That Daphne becomes the laurel tree and therefore Apollo's constant companion, okay? So it's a way of resolving the tension, so to speak. But that's what's painful in myth becomes something that's beautiful and at peace in ritual, right? We talked about these things in hour 25, right? And so you get this kind of resolution of conflict in a way that also, is a tip of the cap to Augustus, right? And to his integration into the poetic tradition and the mythological tradition as well, right? So,
and the use of that metaphor right there. I mean, I love how you're pointing out the painfulness of the situation. Oh shoot, funny. I think the painfulness of the situation is actually highlighted by this connection of the metaphor between, between what happens in the Iliad and then what we see here in this myth. So, so Helen, I think you had a question or comment. I mean, did you want to talk about that?
Just wondering, about the romanization of a Greek, the name of Greek gods. I was wondering if it happened because the Greeks had colonies everywhere. So did it come from the Greek people being, all over the place, or why did they adopt the Greek gods, theogony, So I was just wondering.
Lenny, can you hear us? Okay, I think we have, I think,
I
oh,
think
Lenny, can you hear us now?
I think I figured out what the problem was. There's a choice of networks here, and I was on the slower one.
That's okay. Yeah, and I'm
My
sure the
fault.
network connection today from DC is difficult. I'm sure the
It
bandwidth.
might be, yeah.
Yeah. So, so Helen had posed a question. She's curious about the Romanization of the names of Greek gods.
Uh-huh.
Do you want to help us think about that? Helen was wondering about, does this have to do with, is this because of Greek colonization?
Okay. Well, this is a wonderful topic. The standard name of this is, and I like this name, in Latin, Interpretatio Graeca, the Greek interpretation. Okay, so it's the way the Romans understood the names of the Greek gods as being in their own terms. And in this case, actually, Apollo is an exception. Okay, Apollo survives with his Greek name, and I guess because there wasn't a simple equivalent. But this is the thing that happened because the Greek culture was the pre-existing culture in Italy. Okay, I think you have to understand that the Greeks colonized Italy, the Italic Peninsula, starting in the 9th and the 8th centuries BCE. So, and Greek city-states sent out what are called colonies. These are groups of people who would leave what they called their mother city, their metropolis, okay, and founded a new city that, in order to expand their population, to develop areas of trade, and so forth and so on. So this happened a lot, especially in the 9th and the 8th centuries BCE. And Italy was a fertile place with mineral wealth, and there are some fabulously wealthy Greek colonies in these places. So Rome is just a city-state that became an empire that controlled the Mediterranean world and beyond, okay? It started as a city-state, and it was under the spell of the civilizing influence, if you will, of Greek city-states from its origin. So the oldest text that we have in Latin, the example that easiest to point to is the 12 tables of the Roman law, okay, which is about as old as we can get, have already Greek words, loanwords in them, okay? So these are, the influence of Greeks is there. And so what happens when you have, in effect, what's going on is you have two cultures that are both descended from Indo-European. Okay, I think this is important to understand. It's not that Greeks and the Greeks and the Romans go back to a common ancestor, but in a very remote past. Okay, there are intermediate stages, and so forth. So there's an inherent similarity in the pantheon that was inherited. And Roman religion is very conservative, and so in a lot of cases there are parallelisms, and the way the Greeks understood, for example, Egyptian gods is the same thing that happened with Romans and Greek gods. That is, the Greeks understood the Egyptian deities as forms of their gods, okay? And without the kind of troublesome thing that we might imagine about conflicting religious systems. They just understood them as similar ways of talking about this, about the same things, okay? So transforming the names in interesting ways to local divinities is a phenomenon that of the way in which a prestige culture and a local culture can become assimilated to each other. And in the case of Rome, it's a way in which the Romans adopted Greek culture and made it their own. Okay, I think it's important not to think of this as imitative, but as a kind of adoption. Okay, I think I think the best model for understanding this reinterpretation, if you want, in Roman terms of the Greek pantheon, is when I was a child. Maybe you all were exposed to this, and I learned about maybe they don't teach these things in
I'm sure Lenny will be able to join us again in just a moment. I'm sorry we're having connection issues from Washington, D.C. But I'm curious now, do community members have any other reactions to this passage, or we might go on and read another passage? Anyone else have a comment or question? No? Sarah, I know you just stopped screen sharing, but would you mind screen sharing again? And we can perhaps read another passage. You know, Lenny was just mentioning Roman law as one of the first pieces. I do know one of the passages that we had talked about reading was about this 4 ages. That begins with the discussion sort of the golden age, and I was struck personally by the way that we have discussion about how laws sort of were not necessary, but everyone was still pious already, right? Did anyone, that was kind of an interesting detail for us, especially as we think about the ages of man in the Hesiodic tradition, right? Because we do, as a community, we have thought about the ways that decay is so influential in helping to discern the ages of men, right? Some are just, some are unjust. And we had a chance to look at the different aspects of heroes. So sort of the positive aspect of hero in cult, and the negative aspect of hero in cult, and the positive aspect of hero in epic, and the negative aspect of hero in epic. I'm hearing from Sarah that Bill has a question.
Well, actually, I think the passage.
We can read the passage first.
Yeah, I think Bill's question relates to this passage, so I wondered if,
Great, let's
if I read the passage and then I can follow up with Bill's question.
Great.
But when good Saturn, banished from above, was driven to hell, the world was under Jove. Succeeding times a silver age behold, excelling brass, but more excelled by gold. Then summer, autumn, winter did appear, and spring was but a season of the year. The sun his annual course obliquely made, good days contracted, and enlarged the bad. Then air with sultry heats began to glow, the wings of wind were clogged with ice and snow, and shivering mortals into houses driven sought shelter from the inclemency of heaven. Those houses then were caves or homely sheds, with twining osiers fenced, and moss their beds. Then ploughs for seed the fruitful furrows broke, and oxen laboured first beneath the yoke.
Hi, everybody. I'm back again. Jeez.
Yeah. No worries. You know, I'm wondering, with the connection issues, it might make sense for us to cut this this event a little bit short. I'm thinking, why don't we aim for 11:45 today, and then we could always resume our conversation another day when the connection. I just think the connections out of Washington D.C. are so problematic today. I'm sure the data.
I think that's what's happened. I've never had this happen before.
Ever. Yes, we've never had this connection problem. Yeah.
We have a fiber optic connection. I mean, it shouldn't be doing this thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we just read this beautiful passage, and when you were gone, we were sort of thinking about, you had raised this issue of the early law codes. So we're sort of thinking about the mentions in the Golden Age about their lack of a need for, sort of, I guess, written laws, even though they're able to be pious, and justice is there anyway. So want to help us think about this passage and why you selected it?
Yes, I mean, I think I was interested in I thought the Golden Age is something that you should look at in general because of the having seen the Hesiodic one and what's happened to it here. Okay, and I don't know if you remember. Whoops, can you hear me?
Yes, we do. We hear you, Lenny.
The Silver Age in Hesiod is about children who spend I think it's 100 years as babies, and then they grow up and have a very short time as adults, and it's a very interesting sort of contrast with the Golden Age. Okay, but it's nothing like what's going on here. Okay, and so you can see how Ovid is rethinking this text. Okay, the story of the ages, and in a very interesting way, but again he's paralleling it and contrasting it with the Golden Age, because here you're starting to get you're starting to get laws, and you're starting to get people building houses, and things are cold, and I think if I remember, yeah, you start to have planting of seeds. I can't see the bottom of the text, right? Whereas in the Golden Age, everything they only eat fruits and berries. Okay, it's a vegetarian period in the Ovid's Golden Age, but they don't plant anything. Fields are fallow, are left fallow. Whereas the Silver Age is starting to change towards the Iron Age. So you have you can see that the tendency of this version of the myth is to be what I would call teleological. That is, you start out with a Golden Age and things get worse. Okay.
Somehow it always ends up things are not good in the present, right?
Right. Whereas in the Hesiotic one, it's a very different sort of. Okay. Remember, it goes from you'd expect you have the Golden Age, the Silver Age, and then the Bronze Age and the Age of Heroes. Okay, the metals get messed up. Okay, the sequence of metals gets messed up because the Hesiotic structure is about paired opposites. The golden versus the silver, the bronze versus the Age of Heroes, and then you get to the Iron Age, and the Hesiotic text says, "I wish I was either born before or after." And the other thing that he says is that children were born in the Iron Age with gray hair on their temples. Okay, so that you kind of get a sense that these ages are like the world growing up. Okay. But it's as though you can start again. Okay, there seems to be more of a cyclical thing, whereas here it was something more familiar to us in terms of decadence. But then there's this very strange thing that happens, which is that the Bronze Age, all the other three, he's narrowed it down to the metals. Okay, the gold, the silver, the bronze, and the iron. But the Bronze Age only gets 2 lines. Okay. Just totally.
And our community, we have a community member who has asked about this, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, what sorts of things come to mind about why that would not be there? Yeah.
Sarah, do you want to share what Bill's question?
Yeah.
Yes, Bill Moulton had noticed that Ovid has 4 ages versus Hesiode's 5, and he's quoted the third age called the Age of Bronze, when cruel people were inclined to arms, but not to impious crimes, which slightly surprised him. And just following up, and also going back to what you were talking about earlier with the gods, there's the passage, wherever Nereus roars around the world, and he wonders, is Nereus the same as Okeanos or something different?
Okay, so Nereus is the old man of the sea, and I think there are various metonyms in Latin poetry for the sea. Thetis actually is one. Okay, you can in Latin poetry refer to the whole sea as Thetis, and Nereus has the same kind of function. He represents the sea. Okay, in those terms, absolutely right. But I wondered if anyone else has any ideas about what's going on here with why the Bronze Age would be so suppressed, so to speak, in Ovid's version. Looking at my translation here.
What are you guys thinking?
Does anyone have a sense of it?
I hope you'll feel comfortable. I mean, we don't have to know an answer. I mean, we could, Anne. Yeah, but there's no right or wrong answer. It's a discussion. Please,
yeah, exactly. Just to think about.
No, I wondered what his source was, really, because what struck me about it was that it was telling us about the sort of transition from hunter-gathering into farming. And I thought, well, where does he get that idea from? Is that a folk memory, or where does that come from? And I too was struck that the Bronze Age sort of ceased to exist. It was very brief. It's an intermediary age was the word I used. I was also interested that by the time we got to the Iron Age, land ownership had been introduced. So that whole idea of what was happening to agriculture was still there.
Right.
But I was also interested that relationships began to disintegrate. And I thought, well, that was interesting that for some reason he brought relationships in at that point.
Right. Because you have something like society with rules and stuff like that. I think the last line, the line about Astrea abandoning the earth, okay, is Astrea is epithet of the goddess Justice, okay, and it has to do with being living in cities, okay. There's a sort of embedded message that this is a social community, which is not so clear from the others. Yeah, I think that's very important. Yep. But the Bronze Age, I think maybe you can think about your source if you think about what happens in Hesiod. In Hesiod, you have two versions of this. You have the Bronze Age and then the Heroes' Age. And the Bronze Age are the bad warriors who kill each other, and the Heroes' Age are the good ones. Okay, so the Bronze Age people, they die and are suppressed. The heroes are the ones whose memories are preserved. And you have a contrast between their good divinities who live under the earth. This is the whole notion of hero cult is being alluded to. So it's a very highly developed part of the Hesiodic one, and it's one that's just really elided. Okay, but you do get war in the Iron Age, right? So he wants to sort of displace the evil characteristics of war into iron. So he's blitzed the bronze. I think. Okay, so this is a kind of so I like it because it seems to be very interesting because you can see how fluid this tradition can be. Okay, and there's not a sense of, you may have a source, but it's all right to reread and reinterpret and retell the stories in a way that makes sense to you, okay, and that reflects your priorities, okay. So I think Ovid's very interested in the Iron Age, okay, and in a certain sense, this is an important ideological topic. We were talking about the difficulty of that seems inherent at the end of the Apollo and Daphne story. But a lot of the Augustus's propaganda was that he was bringing back the Golden Age, okay? And you see this explicit in Virgilian poetry, that the arrival of Augustus is a return to the time of Saturn in the terms of Ovid, okay? Whereas here, Ovid seems to be talking about the present, okay, in these very negative terms, right? So you wonder where there's there are things that poets do that can escape ideology and that can tip their hats sort of to it, and interesting things. Sarah, do you want to say something?
Yeah, yes, you were mentioning about the hero cult and in the Bronze Age in the Hesiodic.
Right.
And I was wondering about whether there was hero cult for the ancient Romans. I mean, I know Augustus and some of the other emperors kind of almost invited, set themselves up, as it were, for cult. But,
absolutely.
Was that general, or
yeah? Well,
were there others that were?
I think it's the cult of the emperor as a person, as a god. Okay, and it's and for Augustus, his adoptive father Caesar got deified. Okay, is a transformation of the Greek notion of hero cult. And we actually, for when it comes to Aeneas, we have very interesting, especially in the last 50 years, people have discovered the very old sites in Latium, in the district of Rome, okay, where there was cult of Aeneas as a local hero, very much like a Greek hero cult. So the thinking of Aeneas as the founder of Rome, which in many ways seems very strange, is probably developed by Virgil from a very old and traditional feature in the locale of Rome, okay? So these things are very much alive in the ideology of the empire, and the transformation of it into the deified Augustus himself, okay, is all a reflection of that, yeah. So I think you can see you've moved the deification away from heroes and fighters into a different realm, okay, into a realm of sovereignty and of trying to return to a better life, right? Okay.
Lenny, I so appreciate this conversation. I know the connection has been difficult this morning, so we appreciate you persevering to keep coming back, keep returning to our conversation today, and the many times that you have returned to our community to help us think about these texts. I know this is just the beginning. In the coming weeks and months, we're going to be reading more Ovid. We're going to be reading more Latin literature. Right. So I hope you'll come back and talk to us as we continue to work out these issues. I mean, these are important topics.
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. But I think if I just wanted to sum things up,
please
don't think of Latin literature as imitative of Greek literature or as secondary to it. It's about rethinking these things in their own terms and adopting them and making them function in their own social and ideological and artistic context. Okay, so it has a beauty and an integrity, and there's a systematic quality to it as well that's worth trying to tap into. Okay, don't think of it. I think another model for this for us is British and American literature. You've got a couple of UK people in our group, and I think that's an interesting model. Okay, what's the relationship between American and British literature, or even Canadian is another model, right? How do these cultures assert their individuality, and yet when they feel in a certain sense overshadowed by what has gone before them? Okay, so this is a beautiful and interesting topic and a nice way of approaching this literature. Okay, I'm sorry about the connection, but it's
no
to talk with you about these things. Yep.
Linda, I'm going to ask you to hold on just for 1 second after we stop the broadcast, okay? But at this point, I want to thank all our community members for joining us. I'm sorry we didn't get to hear from all of you, but please do post your comments and questions at the Hour 25/Cosmos Society discussion boards, and we can continue the conversation there. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with Keystone to talk about some new and exciting topics. So we'll see you then.
Great.